in your hymns for worship, number 6.
Awake and sing the song of Moses and the Lamb. Wake every heart and every tongue to praise the Savior's name. Sing of His dying love. Sing of His rising power. Sing how He intercedes above for those whose sins He bore. Sing on your heavenly way, ye ransomed sinners, sing. Sing on rejoicing every day in Christ the glorious King. Soon shall you hear Him say, ye blessed children, come. Soon will He call you hence away and take His pilgrims home. Now be dismissed to class.
Austin, can you guys get me over this? All right, we are in Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5. Are we working, Frank? So let's look at Mark chapter 5. We had just gotten into, give me a minute, let me make sure. I think everything. Oh, okay, thank you. We had just gotten into the beginning of Mark chapter 5 and a very interesting demon possession story. I guess demon possession stories are always a little bit interesting, but this one is especially interesting to us. So to appreciate what all is going on, I think it's really important that we remain in the context of what Mark has been doing. Thank you, Frank. So when we talked at the beginning in the introduction of Mark, there were a couple of themes that we knew were going to continue to be emphasized by Mark about Jesus. Do you remember what some of those may have been? Anybody? It's early. Nobody? I'm going to have to go back to chapter 1. Okay. So, all right, everybody awake? Everybody good? Okay. So my question was the big themes in the book of Mark about Jesus. What were some of those emphases that Mark was going to offer about him? What do we learn about Jesus in the book of Mark? Full authority. Thank you, Mike. I'll get you a cheeseburger this week. That's very good. Okay, so full authority of Christ, Him being the Messiah, Him being the Son of God, all of that is there. But there's also a lot of emphasis by Mark about discipleship as well, and about what it means to be a disciple of the Son of God, especially overcoming fear. And so we're going to see that all the way throughout. We're going to see this emphasis on who Jesus is, the Son of God, His power, His authority, His divinity. That's just going to continue to come forward in our reading of Mark. And we've seen it already. I mean, actually, it happens very quickly when you go back and look at the way Mark begins his gospel. Remember, he begins with the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. He goes right into John the Baptist. He actually does not address the birth of Christ the way Matthew does, the way Luke does. And then he moves on into John the Baptist and his teaching. We have the baptism of Jesus. And remember with Mark, everything's real fast because it's action-packed, just showing us how much Jesus did. And there is one word. Do you remember there is a particular term that helps transition you see over and over and over early on in Mark? Immediately. And immediately is just a way to transition from this action to that action. Now Matthew develops the narrative a great deal. And so sometimes we'll go back to Matthew and he's giving you all this explanation. Mark is just hitting as fast as he can as he moves through to show us how full the life of Christ really was. And we go right into the kingdom language in verses 14 and 15. He gets into making the disciples fishers of men, the temptation of Christ. He only has a couple of verses about the temptation of Christ, but they're very powerful verses. So, for instance, where Matthew might say Jesus was led by the Spirit, what does Mark say? He drove them. Okay, so same concept, but really intense. So Mark's really intense. Now remember, Mark's account is being given to Christians to help them to evangelize the world and to have a written record. Now they had this orally transmitted before, but now they have a written record of Jesus. Okay, so we came to chapter 2. We see him forgiving sins, and right away we see this friction with the establishment. And Mark does something else. Mark shows where common people are gravitating toward Jesus. They're attracted to Jesus. Whereas the Jewish leadership, not so much, okay? So that continues to be developed. Even when we see the calling of Levi or Matthew, he was an outsider. And yet he's brought into Jesus' inner circle to some degree. What were some of the other things he had friction with the Jewish leadership over? Some big topics for Jews. Sabbath. He has a big conversation about the Sabbath. Was Jesus teaching his disciples to violate the Sabbath? No. It was the Jewish leadership's misunderstanding, misinterpretation, binding of their traditional interpretation that was the problem. And so Jesus is actually showing the truth about the Scripture. At the end of chapter 3 there, or verse 13 rather, we have the chosen 12. We talked about the parable of the sower. Why would that be important to his disciples? Yeah, okay, so this is something they were very familiar with. And also, remember, it's the parable of the what? Sower. That was a softball. Sower. Okay, now, a lot of people talk about the parable of the soils. The soils are important, but it's addressed to the sower. Well, his disciples need to know not everybody's going to be receptive. Not everybody is going to welcome the Word of God. Some people will. And remember, we talked about, and Jesus talks about the different conditions of the heart. And that was important for them as well. And he went on and talked about the parable of the seed of the kingdom, how the kingdom is going to expand and grow. It starts very small. And and we talked about this, but this is very important about sharing the gospel. Yeah, we would like, as did the apostles, this immediate big response. And those are the ones that seem to stick in our mind. But he says the kingdom starts one person at a time, one soul at a time, a little bit, and then it grows. He talks about the mustard seed, and yet that big plant that it becomes. Okay, we saw Jesus' power over the sea. Now look at the different events here, okay? So chapter 4, verse 41, key statement. Chapter 4, verse 41. And this goes right along with what I was mentioning to you as Mark's theme. So you'll get these glimpses through Mark of this theme. And we could just read over it. We don't want to do that. We want to pick up what's going on from a thematic standpoint. So you have all of these actions, all of these big events. Think of it from an event standpoint. Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? That question. Well, we see nature obeying Jesus. We see the demons, they don't obey from the heart, but they submit to his power. They recognize who he is. We're going to see a severely ill woman who was healed by him. The dead are going to be raised by him. Those last two are what we're going to study this morning. And all of that is important because we have the physical confirmation, but it also foreshadows a spiritual reality. And we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. So he's the Son of God. He brings peace to the troubled chaos, whether in the natural realm or the spiritual realm. This is Mark's whole point. We see it in the natural realm, but there's also a spiritual reality. And of course, faith is going to overcome fear, hopefully, as we look at this text. Now, that leads us to chapter 5. And I kind of ran through a little bit of the story, but I want us to think about it. It's an intriguing story. So let's read chapter 5. And let's read down through verses 1 through 20. So here's what we're going to do. Garrett, if you could read the first 5 verses. Let's see. Jeremy, if you could get the next 5. Will, the third round there. And the fourth round. Who shall I? Bo? Okay, let's just listen to the story, and as we move through the story, here's a couple of things I want you to have in your mind. How do these themes we've been talking about relate? And why does this happen? That's the big question. Why does it happen the way it happens? So let's just think about that. Okay, let's go ahead.
There was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain. The demons implored him, saying, "Send us into the swine so that we may enter them." Jesus gave them permission. Coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea. About 2,000 of them. They were drowned in the sea. The herdsmen ran away and reported it in the city and in the country, and the people came to see what had happened. They came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed sitting down, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they became frightened.
And those who saw it told them how it happened to him who had been demon-possessed about the swine. They began to flee with him apart from their region. He got into the boat. He who had been demon-possessed begged him that he might be with him. However, Jesus did not permit him. Go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you. Now he has had compassion on you. He departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis all that Jesus had done.
Thank you, guys. Okay, so let's talk about this story. What are some interesting things to you, or things that stand out, or what do you see? There's several. So, Alan, go ahead.
This conversation between Jesus and the demons,
Mm-hmm.
kids already read that it come out. They still have some, they don't immediately come out.
Mm-hmm. Right.
What their disposition.
Right, and we're going to talk more about that. We actually get some information about what's happening with demon possession and that kind of thing, and we're going to come back to that. That's good. Bo. Yeah. This is just insanity, and it's called demon possession. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Garrett, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, Yeah. And I assume they knew him before, and then but they certainly know what's been going on and his behavior. That's what makes the change in him, to Garrett's point, so impressive and impactful, because it's a drastic change, because he ends up just sitting there clothed rightly in his right mind, I'm sure just conversing normally, and they knew that to be so different. So, and the breaking of those chains, and it's legion, so it's not just one demon. I don't know how many it would have gone up to, but if they filled that herd, it's a herd that is filled, legion, you're talking a lot of demons here. So the effect of that. Sarah, were you going to say something? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Oh, I didn't think about that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, there is something to that, I think, because also even with what happens with the herd, what happened with him, it seems very worried about what's going to happen next. Like there was a level of unpredictability and that kind of thing. So go ahead. Yes. Yes. So we're going to get to that in a minute too. That's very important. Anybody else? Go ahead, Will.
It's strange to me that if you're not a Jew or somebody that I would hear about 2,000 pigs water.
Yeah.
How necessary it was for that. I wouldn't even think about it. It's like a story that would get out.
Oh, I see what and it's going to.
It's going to spread. And he could have just as easily just eliminated the demons, and it would just be that story. But the fact that
yeah, there's a reason for that,
yeah.
And that's right. You're right. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead, Tom. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of odd to think there's something that appeals to them enough that they would rather have a demon-possessed man than have Jesus in their area. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So that's all really good. Daryl, go ahead.
These have been people that primarily familiar with the scriptures of the Jews.
That's right.
After all, they're picked on.
They're Gentiles. Yeah, but that presents a whole. They're not Jews, so they would not have been as familiar with Old Testament scripture. Jews would have been repulsed by that kind of work. The other issue, I think, would be that Jesus is actually doing something for the Gentiles. Now, he's very clear he's been sent to the house of Israel, but it didn't mean that there was never anything done in any Gentile area that might foreshadow in and of itself that eventually the gospel, the scope of the gospel, is going to go out. So let's think about several of those questions that we might have. So a few things when we look at this, and you all mentioned those things, when you look at chapter 5, and we see this throughout. We see this in the book of Acts. You remember the incident where the demon says, the sons of Sceva try to, there's a situation where they try to cast out a demon and the demon doesn't recognize their authority, and the demon says, Paul, we know, Jesus, we know, but you, we don't know. We don't recognize your authority. So these evil spirits recognize and acknowledge Jesus' authority. They don't surrender to it. They don't want good things for the cause of Christ. They're in rebellion. But Jesus, it tells you something about Jesus' power here. Now, different demons apparently have a different amount of power. You know, Jesus mentions to his disciples when they try to do some different things, he said this one only comes out with prayer and fasting and that kind of thing. And so faith now this is something interesting too, just from that standpoint. A lot of folks who believe miraculous things are going on will tell you that the sick person needs to have faith in order to be healed. Well, that's not true. There are plenty of times in the Bible the faith was on the part of the person performing the miracle. Now, were there times where people were healed and they showed faith and thus they were healed because they'd shown that kind of faith? Yeah. But there's plenty of times where they didn't until after the miracle. So that's not necessarily a normative thing. So the demons know who Jesus is. They know he's the Son of God. They know that he has power over them and can decide where they go. Hang on to that. We'll be back there in just a minute. Kimberly?
We had a question.
Okay.
When the demon-possessed man approached Jesus, was the man still there along with the demons? So was it the demons that approached him, or was it the man?
Well, we'll come back to that in just a minute, but I would say that the demons were in control of the man. I don't know that I can answer that question. Now, he certainly is going to acknowledge Jesus afterward, and that'll be all him. But it's not that he loses his personality, it's just he's not in control of himself at that point. Because normally he wouldn't be able to, tear out everything that was holding him back and all that kind of thing. We'll come back to that, though. So these demons know that he has power over them and can decide where they go. They know that in the future they will receive final torment. They mention that to him. They know that's coming. They just don't want it to be yet. Okay. And this goes back to Daryl's point. There is, I think, by Mark. Now remember, he has kind of a more Gentile audience. So now Matthew gives this account too. But it does, I think, kind of foreshadow the scope of the gospel eventually is going to be much broader than what you might imagine. The presence of the pigs, that's going to indicate we're in Gentile territory here. Okay. It just would have to be. So you have this large herd. And again, as was mentioned before, I think Will mentioned it, if Jesus wants to just send these demons to the abyss, he can. So there's some reason this all happens. Now, their request, what did they request? They know they're going to be cast out. What did they request? What'd you say? Not to be sent out of the country. Yeah, not to be, to have somewhere to go. And I'm going to give you a passage in a minute as to why. These demons need a host, it seems to me. Let's look at a passage and we'll come back to that. Matthew 12. Come back to Matthew 12. And let's look at verses 43 through 45. Matthew 12, 43 through 45. So in Matthew 12, verse 43, and Jesus just kind of matter of fact says this. He says, now when the unclean spirit goes out of a man, it passes through waterless places seeking rest and does not find it. He then says, I will return to my house from which I came. You might say host. And when it comes, it finds it unoccupied, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and takes along with it 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there. And the last state of that band becomes worse than the first. That is the way it will be with this evil generation. Now his point is, and Peter says the same thing. You remember Peter talks about the one that's escaped the pollution of the world, and he's saved, and then he goes back. He says the latter end is worse with them than the beginning, because they know the truth and they left the truth. It's not like they never knew the truth. Okay. And Jesus is just making a point, but it seems to me from this passage and other passages, they can do a lot more damage if they're indwelling a human being at this time. Now remember, God's allowing this to show Jesus' power over these demons. It seems kind of intensified when we come into the ministry of Christ with these kinds of things happening, so Jesus can show his power over them. I'm sure Satan thought he was gaining power when actually God had allowed him to have it. Having said that, they say, look, he's going to cast us out. Put us into that herd. And it seems from Jesus' statement, they don't want to have to just wander about. Okay. So that gives us some idea about what they're thinking. If you look at the passage, let's go back to Mark. Come back to Mark 5. So you have this man, it's so severe. Verse 4. Well, let's back up. So when Jesus gets out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. Now, back to Kimberly's point, I don't know that the demon wants to meet him. Maybe there's something in the man that wants to get to Jesus. I don't know. That's a good question. And he had his dwelling among the tombs. And no one was able to bind him anymore, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. And no one was strong enough to subdue him. Now that power was coming from the demon. So it's kind of, the man goes to meet Jesus, but yet we know he's possessed. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains and gashing himself with stones. That's the demon doing damage. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him. Now this is what makes me think that's still the demon, Kimberly. Because if you'll notice what he says, he runs up to Jesus. Now, I think the demon recognizes it's Jesus. So he runs up to Jesus, and notice verse 7, what business do we have with each other? Jesus, the Son of the Most High God, I implore you by God, do not torment us. So it's almost as if, to me, the demon recognizes Jesus is coming, says, we have a problem here. So Jesus is coming, and he goes up to Jesus, and they're trying to find a way out of this situation because they assume he's going to want to cast him out. Now, that's just my reading of the text and my understanding. Now, notice how he addresses Jesus. We don't want to have anything to do with you. So how are we going to work this out? They seem to know what might happen. But notice the language, Son of the Most High God. Then I implore you by God, do not torment me. For he had been saying to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. There does seem to be like he's casting us out. He has the power to cast us out, but I don't really want to come out. Then he says in verse 9, and he was asking, what is your name? And this might have something to do with more of a struggle than normal. And he said to him, my name is Legion, for we are many. And he began to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now that goes back, I think, to Matthew 12, what Jesus said. They don't want to have to just roam about. Now there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain, and the demons implored him, saying, send us into the swine so that we may enter them. Okay, it seems like they're saying, put us somewhere. And they don't want to go to Tartarus. Remember, Tartarus is a place of torment for wicked spirits that are reserved. Even angels that have sinned are going to be in Tartarus. They don't want to be cast out into the abyss. Stay with me here. Jesus gave them permission. But here's the thing. Jesus gives them permission, but I don't see anything where they understand what's about to happen. So Jesus gives them permission, and they're probably thinking, this is better. But it wasn't. Jesus gave them permission, and coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine. And the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them. There's your number of the demons. And they were drowned in the sea. I don't think, this is just my reading, I doubt they thought that was going to happen. So he puts them into the herd. They run down, they drowned. Now what if they do need a host, they're gone. Now so here's the question. Jesus could have just put it, like Will said, he could have just cast, not even messed with the herd. But there's a couple of reasons why he may have done this. Number one, everybody's going to know. So if you're an invisible spirit, basically, yeah, they see the man's conduct change. But then they're going to watch their 2,000 pigs go off into the abyss. So he's going to deal with these demons. He's going to make a point, a visible expression of his power. Okay, that all happens. But I think there may be a third thing going on here as well. And you just have to read and come to your conclusions about it, but let's look at the rest of what happens here. So the herdsmen ran away. They see this and they reported it in the city and in the country, and the people came to see what it was that had happened. Can you imagine that message? You know that guy that we know something's definitely wrong with him, that's breaking all the chains and we can't hold down, and he looks demon-possessed. They would have had some knowledge of demon possession, I would think. Well, he's acting like he's in his right mind now, and our whole herd just went off into the abyss here. So how do we handle this? And this goes back to the point Tom made. I think you would normally think that with that power and that authority, I don't care if you're a Jew or a Gentile, you've surely got some sick folk. Surely you want to listen to this man that has this power and authority. Even if you think, man, this is really unpredictable and I wonder what's going to happen next, I still want to talk to that man. I want to meet that man. I want to know who he is and what his background is and all of that. That's not what they do. By Jesus allowing those demons to go into their livestock, he deals with the angels, but he also forces them to make a decision. What decision would that be? What's more important? Our livestock? Our money? Life just being like it's been in the past? Or talking to Jesus and being with this one that did this and allowing faith to overcome fear of what might happen? This faith versus fear thing happens a lot in Mark, the tension of those things. All of them have fear. But these folks are allowing their fear to overcome their opportunity for faith. And it seems to me that's what the story is about. I don't have another good explanation that I can come up with as to why I think this, because he didn't have to do that, but there was a reason for him doing it. Okay, that's the best I got. Anybody got anything else? Go Will, and then we'll come back to Alan.
Are we starting to transition from don't tell anyone about what you saw here, what was done?
Okay,
because when you read the
good.
next story, instead of just letting the woman that was healed just let it be, he points it out, he stops, and he makes a scene of what just happened in her faith.
Yes.
Are we starting to transition to where he wants his name to get out?
I don't know if that's possible, but at the very least, it may depend on the person and the situation. I don't know. That's a good question. There does seem to be a transition in Mark, though. I mean, because when we get later on in Mark, he's not telling anybody the secret's not being kept so much.
Up until this point, he
Yeah.
don't go tell anyone.
Right. He's been very, very adamant. In this case, notice, let's read the rest. And they came to Jesus, verse 15, observed the man who had been demon-possessed sitting down, clothed in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion, and they became frightened. And those who had seen it described to them how it had happened to the demon-possessed man and all about the swine. And they began to implore him to leave their region. Now, I can understand, it's shaking you up. But they just don't want this. They don't want all of this, I guess, drama, you would say, and this losing of their livestock, and they don't want it. Look at verse 18. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was imploring him that he might accompany him. Now, I want you to see something. That man's responding to Jesus the way these other folks should have responded to Jesus. He's saying, can I come with you? They're saying, leave our region. So Mark's doing something here. Some people are going to ask Jesus to get out of their lives. Other people are going to ask that they be a part of his ministry. Now, notice Jesus, and he did not let them, but he said to them, go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So Will, you may have a point there that this seems to be an important moment. And he went away and he began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things Jesus has done for them, and everyone was amazed. At this time also, you might remember, the Gentiles aren't not exactly trying to kill Jesus at this time. The Jews would like to get rid of him. And so I don't know if that has something to do with the people he's talking to. I've got Alan and them come back to Roger. Alan, what did...
I think this concept of fear and God's power, as you mentioned, is repeated throughout Scripture. A lot of it has to do with man's realization of his sinfulness in comparison to the holiness of God and his power. Now, in this case, that may have not been the case, but right before that, in chapter 4, the disciples were afraid when he calmed the seas. Peter was afraid in Luke 5 when he saw Jesus' power. On Mount Sinai, they were afraid of the power of God. They wanted Moses to go. So these repeated occasions of just a stark contrast between weak, sinful man and all-powerful God. And when he demonstrates his power, I mean, we probably can't begin to grasp what that feels like. I mean, Sinai, they thought they were going to die. When they witnessed these miracles, it was so overwhelmingly powerful that they just didn't know how to deal with it.
And I hadn't fully thought it, but as we're talking, it may well be that is the point, that some people would come in contact with the power of Jesus, and while there was a level of fear, there was a level of, I want relationship with him. We're about to see some examples of that. But then there are others who just want to keep him out of their lives. They don't want to think about the idea of Jesus' power. It makes them very uncomfortable. Or even the existence of God makes them very uncomfortable. And so it may be that Mark is, I don't know, it's just an idea, but I mean, it seems that Mark, in all of these instances, he does show, you're right, that you'll have this wonderful miraculous sign, you'll have a level of fear. Some people choose the faith over the fear, and then other people choose the fear over the faith, like they're afraid of him rather than seeking him. So that may well be. That's a good point. Okay, I got several hands. Who did I have after Alan? I know I got to come back to Daryl and then come to Todd. Do you have something? Okay. Go, Roger.
I think it's interesting that whenever people come out and they tell Jesus, no, don't come, he does force himself on them.
That's right.
But he does send the man. He says, you go tell.
The man who wanted to accompany him.
Yeah, you go tell.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yes. Well, and you're taking a man who actually experienced the freedom and the liberty of, and also the bondage of what he had been through. So, firsthand testimony there. Okay, I have Daryl, and then I'm coming back to Todd.
Happens in Acts when Paul goes into the city, presents the gospel, and sometimes he gets between people and their money.
That's true.
Same kind of thing happening later with Paul, that he's run out of town.
That's exactly right. So I think there's several things. There's fear, there's some covetousness going on here, and there's faith. And so you have all of those work, which is interesting because those three things are talked about Jesus repeatedly in his ministry. The issue of fear, do not be afraid, the issue of faith, and the problem of covetousness. And with Mark, you have this real life example of how it all interplays. Todd.
You know, with this being one of Jesus' many miracles that he did, you know, the end of this story in verse 20, all men marvel about this.
Right.
They were amazed. And look back at the purpose of miracles and the time of the miracles
Right.
Jesus did. When Jesus went before Pilate, and then Pilate sent it to Herod, what was Herod? He was wanting to see a miracle.
Yep.
Jesus didn't perform a miracle before Herod because he knew it wouldn't do any good. But I see when we study this story, the timing and purpose of miracles that Jesus did
Yes.
had a purpose, and they fulfilled the purpose.
Yeah. He didn't do it just to do it.
He didn't do it just to do it. And here at the end of this story, the last phrase, all men marvel at this.
Yeah, that's right. There, look at verse 20. And before that, he says, tell him what the Lord, now that's interesting. Jesus did it for him. What the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed. And you remember the woman at the well. She goes back. She tells. They're amazed. They want to talk to Jesus. So all of that is important. Now what we're going to do, I'm going to stop right there. Next Sunday morning, Lord willing, we're going to shift gears, but really we're going to stay in this. So try to remember some of this. We're going to have Jairus. We're going to move from a Gentile area to a man that's a synagogue official. And he's going to come to Jesus. And he's going to ask for this healing of his little 12-year-old daughter. And in the middle of him going there, we're also going to read about a woman who was hemorrhaging and had been doing so for some number of years. And the physicians and doctors had only made it worse. And she just wants to touch Jesus' clothing. And there's some really interesting things that happen here. So fear, faith, Jesus' power, all those things are going to keep being developed. So we'll stop right there.